It's a great pleasure to host this panel, which is jointly sponsored by NYU Center for Global Affairs and the International Center for Transitional Justice. And this is one of several panels we've done together. We're also very privileged to host and welcome the activists and scholars featured on the panel. I'll offer introductory remarks and then turn over moderation to Myriam Roccatello, who is Deputy Executive Director and Director of Programs of the International Center for Transitional Justice. Our country has recently been jolted into examining the questions raised by the Black Lives Matter movement. The questions were always there, but they perhaps had not fully pervaded the consciousness of the general public. Now they have, except for those who choose to ignore the questions raised or actively deny that they exist. The Black Lives Matter movement can perhaps provide a catalytic spark for a broader re-examination of past legacies, as well as continuing discriminatory practices. Tonight's discussion will focus on systemic racism against persons of color. But I also hope we eventually broaden the dialogue to include historic and current treatment of Native Americans, Japanese American internment, and the US torture program post 9/11. We have a clear and urgent need to examine past and current discriminatory practices and crimes. And I say crimes because, of course, slavery and lynching are horrific crimes, as well as some of the police brutality we have seen. There are many past precedents for having this discussion and figuring out how best to bring redress. One can draw upon experiences from South Africa in terms of its Truth and Reconciliation Commission in confronting the practices of apartheid, to experiences from in many countries such as Peru, Argentina, Chile, East Timor, and many others. By now, there's significant practice in having truth commissions, and panelist Dr. David Fakunli will tell us about his important work as chair of the Maryland Lynching, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There have also been many reparations programs to date, and these can be used as models, and Dr. Ron Daniels will tell us about his key role as convener of the National African American Reparations Commission and their 10-point reparations plan. We also can discuss the role of apology. An apology for past horrific practices seems hardly sufficient, but it is a necessary starting point for acknowledging past wrongdoing. We also have precedent in terms of memorialization, and that there is already, of course, an ongoing dialogue in the US, which has been belatedly dismantling Civil War monuments, and this could be more robustly coupled with discussion of new monuments. Historic memory is being preserved in places such as the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, remembering the more than 4,400 African-American men, women, and children lynched between 1877 and 1950, to the work of Piper Anderson and a Rikers Island Public Memory Project. Institutions of higher learning are also re-examining their historical practices, sometimes renaming themselves and grappling with uncomfortable truths about their historical relationships to slavery. As to police brutality in international transitional justice terminology, we might say there's a need for security sector reform or vetting. More plainly put, there is a need for policing reform. Other wrongs don't have a direct corollary in transitional justice, things as redlining that needs to be reversed by greenlining. We see how years of systematic denial of mortgages, insurance, and loans has been one of the factors entrenching income inequality. Unequal access to healthcare has been thrust into the spotlight during the COVID pandemic, as we see higher fatality rates in underserviced communities, such as many communities of color, which then have higher percentages of pre-existing conditions. Another area one could discuss would be the teaching of history. If one wants to build awareness in next generations, it's key to examine textbooks. Tonight's discussion will frame our discussion in terms of transitional justice, but we could call it civil rights, we could call it human rights, and the denial of the right to be free from discrimination, which is guaranteed under the International Covenant Civil and Political Rights to which the US is a party. The field of transitional justice seems a natural way to approach this dialogue, one that has been long overdue, both in academic circles such as this one and in raising a broader national consciousness. With that, I will turn over this panel to Myriam Roccatello, who, in addition to being Deputy Executive Director and Director of Programs of the International Center for Transitional Justice, currently oversees all its global and country programs. With over 25 years of experience in rule of law, human rights, and transitional justice, she joined ICTJ after working at the UN for 15 years. She's an Italian lawyer qualified to practice in Italy and the UK. She's been teaching transitional justice at the Biococa University of Milan since 2014. Myriam.
Thank you very much, Professor Trahan, Jennifer. And now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to all of you our distinguished panelists. As Jennifer already mentioned in her brief introduction, we have with us tonight Dr. Ron Daniels, who I'm sure you know is a veteran social and political activist and was actually an independent candidate for president of the United States in '92. His academic achievements are many, but I have elected to mention that he is a distinguished lecturer emeritus at York College of the City University of New York, where he taught many courses on political science. He was from 1993 to 2005. He served as the first African-American executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, a period in which the center emerged and was at the forefront of many fights for constitutional rights. And he also has a significant experience overseas because he had the opportunity to lead a mission to Haiti, and as a result of which he mobilized political and material support for the struggle for democracy and development in that country. He's a well-known columnist and he writes many articles in numerous Black and progressive newspapers and websites nationwide. He's the founder and president of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, IBW, which is a resource center dedicated to empowering people of African descent and marginalized communities. As the administrator for the National African American Reparation Commission, he has been at the forefront of the US and global reparation movements. The Commission has devised the 10-point reparation programs, and is obviously a firm supporter of the HR 40, the congressional bill that would establish a national commission to study reparation proposals for African Americans. We also have with us Mrs. Anderson. Piper Anderson is the founder and president of Create Forward, a social impact firm that produces experiences to advance equity and justice. Her career spans over 20 years and has traveled through arts, youth development, community organizing, education, and the healing arts. All of these varied, very rich experience has provided her with a very interdisciplinary, obviously, toolbox of different strategy based certainly on cultural endorsement to advance social change. She's a writer and a performance artist, but I was particularly stricken by her work in the educational theater that I'm sure she was instrumental in enabling her to reach out and engage youth and a variegated audience to promote transformative facilitation practices with communities. In 2016, Mrs. Anderson was awarded a TED residency to develop an innovative storytelling project called Mass Story Lab. This initiative has traveled to more than 13 US cities, creating storytelling laboratories that center the experience of people impacted by incarceration and channeling those personal stories to instruments of justice. She's also a professor of NYU Gallatin School and a founding member of the advisory board and faculty of NYU's prison education program. She has guest lectured at universities across the country. And again, thank you very much, Piper, for being with us tonight. We also have Dr. David Fakunli, who is the chair of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the first state commission in the United States dedicated to chronicling and bringing justice to racial terror lynching. David is also the co-founder and CEO of Discover Me, Recover Me, an organization that empowers narratives for personal and organizational growth through the African oral tradition. David likes to describe himself as a mercenary for change. So he's highlighting his willingness to employ any talent and occupy any space to elevate anyone who feels divested from their self, particularly people of color. He earned a PhD at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he's currently associate faculty in the mental health department and serves as adjunct faculty at the University of Florida Center of Arts in Medicine. And last but not least, my dearest colleague, Mrs. Ladish. Virginie Ladish is a senior expert at ICTJ, who distinguished herself through many years of dedication to study, research, and advancing the policy thinking about children affected by gross violation of human rights and serious violation of humanitarian law, and youth participation in these very complex processes of political change where youth and children are often forgotten. Through this very detailed, very passionate work, she has developed a unique talent and ability to foster participation, dialogue, and ownership of the processes that are deputed to provide justice and contribute to the transformation of the social context. And she worked in many, many countries that it would be difficult to list here, but I am always very emotional to have her with me in a panel and to work with her hand by hand every day. So with that, I am then, if you allow me, start with the first round of questions. I've asked our distinguished panelists to keep their answer to a certain time limit so that we can then offer the audience ample room for interaction and for asking additional questions. I will revert back, however, because the experience of the panelists was so rich that it was impossible to capture it with one question. So I will revert back with a second tour of questions before opening the floor to the audience. Dr. Daniels, here we are. As a prominent leader in the fight for cultural, social, economic, and political equality for all in the US, and on the basis of your wide experience in the effort of advance and achieving, finally, acknowledgement and accountability, do you think that these processes that have been applied and continue to be applied internationally in context of what we call political change, not to use the transitional justice term that may be known only to few, context of political change, like truth seeking, reparation, criminal accountability for certain, but also the so-called guarantees of non-recurrence. All these set of measures to redress and prevent abuses that occurred, the many violations suffered. Do you think that this varied set of mechanisms and processes would be relevant and beneficial in the US? And in your views, which one among those would be most effective or most relevant? You may need to unmute it.
First of all, let me just thank you for framing the conversation and to being a part of this extraordinary panel, which I hope to learn a lot from and to connect with in terms of the people who are doing this work, which is one of the things we do with the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, which is the overarching administrator for the National African American Reparations Commission. FYI, I sometimes wish we would shorten the introductions. That would leave a lot more time for the Q&A, but that's just the way I handle it. Let me just say that I think that all of the various ways of addressing racism and structural institutional racism that you referred to are relevant. For example, the whole question of truth seeking or truth telling is certainly important. But I would caution people about referencing the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa, simply because the notion that somehow, and very often it seems that Black people in particular are seen as the people who can absorb so much pain, and how we are so gracious and you know, and whatnot. Well, from a psychocultural perspective, I think Frantz Fanon and others would say this is really not a good thing. And so the process in South Africa, properly understood, was a compromise. It was something that was done as a way of trying to move on to the process of democratic governance. But it was not really a good process in terms of dealing with people who had inflicted harm, because they were allowed to essentially confess and in many instances move on. And so today, even Bishop Tutu and others are saying this process fell short of what it ought to be. Because at the end of the day, truth telling should end injustice. And that is always the end game. You know, it must end injustice. But yet, and so to the degree that we engage in truth telling or truth and reconciliation, I prefer truth and justice, it can be a good process. And I think this is happening around the country. But I caution about this first form simply because I kind of see this, you know, popping up around the country. And it's quite easy for people to engage in truth telling. The difficult part has to do with remedy. When we look at efforts within the criminal justice system, for example, certainly there can be reparative, and I use my terms deliberately, reparative mechanisms that can be used and ought to be used. For example, the whole quest to legalize marijuana, for example, and in fact, to some degree, all drugs, has to do with the fact that it was largely African-American communities that were targeted, that were damaged by by the war on drugs, really. And so when you look at Prop 64 in California that we've worked on in other places, the idea of a piece of legislation policy remedying some of those damages is certainly incredibly important. In fact, reinvesting in those communities, but not only reinvesting, expunging records so that people who were afflicted will now be free. And at the end of the day, being in a position where people who were sellers can now be entrepreneurs, you know, formerly incarcerated persons, because there was no reason why their ingenuity in the first place should have been victimized in that way. And let me just say that in Evanston, Illinois, where we have supported and helped to certify a reparations initiative, they actually use the funds from the recreational marijuana to actually fund the reparations initiative, which I thought was an excellent loop to close in terms of justice. Now, I think of all of these, the issue of, and by the way, the question of non-repetition is a well-established principle of international law. And many of the groups, particularly the Movement for Black Lives, has been in the forefront. And I think the organization in COBRA has helped to institutionalize the notion of international law, that non-repetition of behavior is an incredibly important part of the remedy. But of all of these remedies, obviously I'm biased. I think that the question of reparations is at the forefront. And I believe this because really, as Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee has said as the architect of HR 40, as you have noted, the bill to study reparations proposals for African Americans, which is no longer a bill to simply study it, but to study in what form the proposals will take. All of the other measures, whether it's the voting rights legislation now before Congress, or the Floyd bill, in terms of criminal justice reform, all of these are incredibly important. But we have to get at some point to the heart of the original sin, or one of the original sins, because I think Native Indigenous people, we have to also reference that as well. And so it is reparations that cuts to the heart of the issue of indeed dealing with finally repairing the damages. And by the way, the definition is very simple. It is repairing damages inflicted or harm inflicted by a group or a nation or an organization, institution on another group. And so the repair, is about helping to make sure that there is no longer repetition of it, but the apologies are part of the process. But at the end of the day, it's also about remedy, which can be compensation in various forms and whatever. So I know we'll talk about it more later, but just in terms of my introductory notions, I think all of the remedies that have been cited have a place and can be effectively utilized in the process of dealing with racism in this country and indeed around the world.
Thank you very, very much. Actually, I think that in ICTJ, we couldn't agree more with you about cautioning against the South African purist model. And we would have a lot to say about this goal that truth-seeking seems to have inherited progressively of reconciliation, while in reality, truth-seeking is a value in itself, and it's a justice measure, and then reconciliation can come. But having said that, Piper, may I ask you this question that has been very much in our heart since we knew that you were part of this panel, because the world after the murder of George Floyd has seen a widespread effort to challenge symbols and previous memorialization of contestable historical events. Not only in the US, this trend has reached other European countries, rightfully so, but it also, it pointed again at the value in itself of memory, the value of symbol and history for sure. But in order to create history, to create the narrative of history, the different experience and narratives have to be captured, have to be given space and equal dignity. So I am particularly touched by the work that you have done, that you are doing. And I would like to hear your views about the importance of memory in the context of your work with the Rikers Island Public Memory Project, and the role that the community particularly plays in the struggle for justice.
Thank you all. Thanks for the opportunity to be here with you. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm on Lenape land here in New York, and acknowledge the Lenape elders and ancestors and community, and also just name the legacy of settler colonialism and white supremacy that has created erasure for Indigenous people and for Black people on this land since its inception. So with that, I want to say that part of the practice of memory, I think, is really about changing even the ways that we engage, right? The way we speak to each other, the way that we introduce ourselves, right? The way that we acknowledge in all the ways that we can the constant acts of erasure that are happening all around us every single day, right? To question, right? Things like the land that we're standing on, the meaning of words that we take for granted, that are the names of cities and towns and streets, right? All of these things just help to reorient us to think about the world that the country that we live in its origins. And I think that's really a part of the work You mentioned the focus on sites of memory, and I think that even before this summer, across the country, young people on college campuses were demanding that that the administrations acknowledge that there were monuments on their campuses to white supremacy. Even before this, in the last couple of years, I've visited a few colleges where I was asked to speak on public memory because of that very reason, because of young people wanting to hold institutions to account. This spring, I'll be teaching a course at NYU at Gallatin called Community Acts of Redress, Justice, and Memory. And so, I think that the work is about this constant and daily commitment to remembering, not just when we look at a monument, but each and every day, but also to understand this within a larger frame that's about dismantling white supremacy, right? Because white supremacy demands that we forget, right? The myth of white supremacy demands that we forget who we are, that we forget who walked this land before us. So, for me, the work is rooted in an abolitionist frame, right? A commitment to dismantling those institutions that make it impossible for us all to thrive. And the beginning of that is the process of truth telling and memory. Unfortunately, in this country, we like to jump over truth and get right to reconciliation, right? Before we've even acknowledged the truth piece. I'm just going to share my screen to just share just a couple of slides with you all. So the first is like in the work that I do, I'm constantly asking these questions, what should we remember? Why should we remember, and how should we remember? The images on the left over here, one of them at the very top is from Forsyth County, where 1,100 Black people were lynched and their homes burned and run out of town in Forsyth, Georgia in 1912. The bottom image is from Carlisle Industrial School, which is one of many Indian boarding schools in this country that led to the abuse and erasure of Indigenous children and disconnection from their families and their culture. So, even remembering moments like this and remembering to tell these stories is how we reclaim memory. So, for me, again, this is about the work of countering white supremacy. And so at its best, the public memory process can play an essential role in recording and repairing state and institutional harms that have erased targeted communities from public history. So that's really kind of premise behind much of my work. And I think that testimony is a beginning part of that, but it's a strategy towards justice. And so testimony is instrumental in defining organizing strategies. In testimony, we discover how communities have survived and find solutions to shared problems. We hold institutions and individuals accountable for harm, and we call the US to reckon with the impact of mass criminalization and the drug war. So, this particular project, right, that I started my work on with this Mass Story Lab that you mentioned was about reckoning with the impact of incarceration. Half of Americans across race have someone in their life who has been incarcerated. So this is not something that's just like affecting Black people, although Black people are disproportionately impacted by mass criminalization, disproportionately the victims of racial terror, racial control, but something that is an American story more broadly and demands that we reckon with the ways that we've addressed punishment up until this point. And so, so the testimonies and the telling of stories is the first way to begin that process. But it's not the end, right? So this is just the acknowledgement of the harm. What then has to happen is that the harm ends, right? That we end mass criminalization, we end those systems of policing and incarceration that target Black communities. We end the abuse, we end the conditions that lead to that abuse and that harm, and that we ultimately lead to reparations. So in Mass Story Lab, we focused on three things. One was restoring agency, which was about like giving people the opportunity to own their stories, using those collective shared stories to reveal the impact of incarceration. And then from there, inviting community members to collectively move from the individual story to thinking about the collective story, the collective impact, and collectively define what justice should look like. And then, that project led to the development of the Rikers Public Memory Project, which is the initiative that I'm currently working on. Rikers is is scheduled to close in 2026. It is the last penal colony in the country. Others like it, island penal colonies around the world have closed, Robbins Island being the other one. Shaw, so these other places have closed. Alcatraz was the one here, other one here in the States. Rikers is the last one. People, often call it Torture Island because of the kind of abuse that has happened there. It's also a place in which, until recent years, people had no idea. They could not point to it on a map. You looked at a subway map and on the subway in New York City, and it wasn't on there. People had no idea where Rikers was. It only lived in their memory. But it is a monument to to white supremacy from its very origins. And so the community truth and healing process, one started with the collection of 106 stories of people who experienced the harm at Rikers. Those stories are now going to live in the New York Public Library's public catalog so that people can access those narratives. We're now developing a multimedia exhibition that's going to travel, where we activate the stories as well as the history. We have an incredible team that we're working with to create this exhibit that will tell the entire history of Rikers. And then a public house initiative, which is the next piece, in which we are sort of asking, how can we quantify the harm of Rikers? How can we look at the ripple effect of one person being incarcerated there, returning home, the trauma that they carry with them back into their families, back into their neighborhoods? What is the longer and more escalating impact of a place like Rikers, so that we can make the case for reparative justice. So that's that project. I'm going to stop there because I think we'll have more opportunity to talk later. But thank you.
Yes, for sure. We have so many questions that I'm allowed only to ask you one more, and hopefully the audience will pick up the other issues that I forget. I'm actually very interested in following up with you separately this conversation about the expectations to erase the memory, because actually what we find, or what we would be in our position more inclined to consider, is the expectations to accept, which is to some extent even worse. That probably happened, but we need to move on somehow. But now, David,
talk more about that. I think in a U.S. context, it's erasure, and it's a total revision of the story.
Yes, definitely. But okay, thank you very much, David. Here, your turn now. So we have followed with really great interest the creation and startup of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we are, of course, we're very supportive of your efforts. And I think they will be, it would be a great opportunity to advance generally, not only the struggle in the US, but the thinking generally in the field. First of all, I would like to ask you to share with the audience a little bit about the commission, because there might be some that are not as familiar with its establishment and mandate. But then, if you may, if I can, actually, if I can ask you really to go a little bit more in details about how you plan to operationalize your mandate, and particularly what are the priorities that you have or you are in the process of identifying for the work of the Commission.
All right. Well, first and foremost, thank you all for this opportunity to tell my story. Um, much as Piper recognized the land on which we are on, so certainly where she is, I just recognize the fact that I am the descendant of my ancestors who were brought to this country against their will. On my father's side, he is a proud Nigerian immigrant, but on my mother's side, I can only go back so far because of the institution of slavery. And yet, despite all the horrors of that institution, I'm still here. So it's certainly a testimony to all that has been survived and allowed to thrive, even in the midst of such tragedy and horror. So the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we are just a baby. We've only been around for a little over a year. We were created through House Bill 307 in the Maryland General Assembly in 2019. We were voted in unanimously, and I love to say that because I'm sure not everybody to a person was really on board with us coming into existence, but they certainly voted yes for us. So we use that as leverage and the power of what we aim to do. So our charge is to chronicle and bring justice to the 40 plus confirmed racial terror lynchings that occurred in the state of Maryland between 1854 and 1933. Now, the reason we say racial terror lynchings is because lynchings have occurred within races. White people have lynched white people, black people have lynched black people, so forth and so forth. But the lynchings that we are particularly focused on are those lynchings that occurred against Black people, African Americans, for the preservation of white power and white supremacy. It's important to know that lynchings meant and do serve a purpose of intimidation. They serve the intent of reminding people what can happen if you step out of line within the system of white power and white supremacy. So our charge is to elevate the history. And one thing that I stress as chair is we're not recreating the wheel. We know that there have been and still are local coalitions throughout the state of Maryland within its various counties. We know that there are research institutions, educational institutions that have chronicled this work. There's the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. There's been Bowie State University. There have been individual researchers and historians that have done a plethora of work on really telling the story of racial terror lynching in the state of Maryland. So we're not going to step over their work. We just want to elevate it with the platform that we have. I think the hallmark of what we will do will be the hearings. So far, the hearings are on hold because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Something that we're thinking about is whether we'll have to make it virtual, and that's a very real possibility. We would love to have this in person, but as I've said, I'm not going to bring a bunch of elders into a room and possibly get them sick and infected with COVID. That would defeat the purpose. So we must make it virtual. We will make it virtual. But the hearings, above all else, are an opportunity for people, the descendants of victims, and that is certainly a primary focus of ours, is to find the descendants of racial terror lynching victims, the descendants of racial terror lynching perpetrators, and the descendants of racial terror lynching spectators to tell their story. One thing that we know for sure is that these stories have been passed down through the generations. So despite the fact that the last confirmed racial terror lynching in Maryland was 1933, we know those stories exist. They exist in the families and the communities in which these lynchings took place. And we know that they have had an effect. It is not just the immediate effect of the lynching itself, but certainly the systems that allowed the lynching to happen. We want to know the stories. We want to know what has been the consequences of these lynchings that have occurred in the state of Maryland. And ultimately, we want to bring justice. Now, we are not a prosecutorial body. We cannot prosecute anybody. We are just here to, again, tell the story of what happened. One thing that, and I agree with the brother on the panel, that notion of focusing just on the reconciliation. We are a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We know that's the typical name of bodies like this, but we really are about justice. And one of the things that has refocused my orientation as leading this initiative is that it's the healing plus the justice that will bring reconciliation. So that's really our focus. We want people to heal, because a story as profound as this one, racial terror lynchings, and if anyone has seen a picture of a racial terror lynching, it sticks with you. It's not something that goes away very easily. I am so grateful to the National Great Blacks in Wax Museum for their lynching exhibit, which is something I was introduced to when I was about 13 or 14 years old. I'm a child of that museum, and I can go into that another day. So I had the opportunity to deal with the horrors of racial terror lynchings at a young age. So where I am right now, I understand it for what it is. And the pain is not what it used to be. I can compartmentalize it to really get to the point of what the lynchings were made to do. But think of those families, those generations of people, of communities, of towns that have never had a chance to tell the story outside of their own homes, and the pain and the trauma that they've had to sit with for those generations, the traumas that's been passed down for those generations. We want to create a platform and a space for them to tell the story. There is healing in just telling the story. Part of what I do as a storyteller is just that, to strengthen people's drive and power to tell their story. And I've seen how people have just been lifted because of the opportunity to tell their story in their own way. So that is what the hearings are aimed to do. And then finally, to bring justice. It is about how do we repair the honestly irreparable damage that has occurred, not just because of the lynchings, but again, the systems that allowed the lynchings to happen. So how do we repair the criminal justice system? How do we repair the judicial system? How do we repair the legislative system? How do we repair the educational system? Well, these are things that we're all talking about. There is nothing off the table for this commission, primarily because we are the first of its kind. So we get to set the bar. We set the bar real high. All right. We setting the bar really, really high. There is no, we're happy to be here, all that. No. You gave us this power. We gonna use it. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So when we talk about reparations, that's on the table. When we talk about an overhaul of the educational system, that's on the table. When it comes to holding the systems accountable, that's on the table. There is nothing off limits when it comes to, again, bringing justice and bringing healing to communities, families that have been affected by racial terror lynchings. So that is what I'm proud of. I'm so proud of the work that we've done so far. It doesn't feel like a year. It feels like multiple years, but it's only been a year, and the best is yet to come. And there's opportunities like this that really make me so happy, because I want people to know about this. I want everybody to know about this across the United States, across the world. Start to call out your communities, call out your cities, call out your governments. If you know that there is an injustice, a systemic injustice that has been done or is being done, now's the time to call it out. So I am happy that people see us as a beacon of hope, as a model, as a template. Use us in every way possible to get the job done of bringing justice to the people. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David, very much. Virginie, I'm supposed to ask you a question, but as me, I suspect that there is so much we are absorbing from the panelists, so many important things that we experience every day, the importance and the multiple facets of storytelling, truth seeking as a form of acknowledgement, as a form of justice, even reparation, as David said, the importance how you see victims and survivors transform through testimony and acknowledgement. So what this conversation has inspired you, particularly, forward looking at a future where possibly we would be finally able not only to correct, but prevent this type of terrible deviances?
Thank you very much, Myriam, and thank you to all the speakers. I just want to start by saying I'm really honored to be on such a distinguished panel of scholars, lecturers, leaders, and activists. For my part, for over 20 years, I've worked in the field of international human rights, but as a US citizen and living here, especially over the past 5 to 8 years, I've increasingly felt this pull to start applying the insights I've learned from working with people in different contexts to my home country. So I'm really honored to be here today and to see the momentum building within the US for more of this kind of work to be done locally. Every context is unique, of course, and I think that's also doing international work. We always hear that there are certain countries, oh no, but Colombia is different. Oh no, the Gambia is different. And in this case, the US is different, but keeping that in mind, I think there's still a lot that we can learn and take inspiration from. And I think to your point, Dr. Daniels, it's really important that we don't see international experiences as recipes or formulas to follow. Each country develops its own process based on their certain context and circumstances. So with that in mind, I just want to share a few things to keep in mind from my international experience, and really focusing on how we can frame the discussion here in the US in a way that helps ensure that the reforms that are needed to happen to bring about transformation and prevention have the best chance of taking hold. So as all the speakers before me have clearly demonstrated, the injustices that we face in the US go far beyond individual acts of brutality or violence or isolated incidents that we're looking at today. What we're dealing with in the US is sustained and systemic legacy of white supremacy that's entrenched in our social, economic, cultural, and cultural fabric from before the founding of this country. So up against this magnitude of a problem, I want to propose that transitional justice can be a useful conceptual frame that can help us kind of think about how we want to proceed. And I say that because transitional justice, sometimes, as Myriam mentioned, we don't want to use the word so much transitional, because then people might say, hey, but there's no transition in the US, this doesn't apply here. But rather than focusing on the idea of transition, this field developed precisely for this type of situation that we're facing in the US. So that is a context where the violations are so massive, so sustained, so systemic that the traditional court system can't bring about justice. So in that case, I often like to think about transitional justice as creative problem solving. How do you get the most justice in a context where justice seems maybe impossible or the odds are stacked against you? So with that, if you try and boil down a little bit what transitional justice is about, it's the guiding principle is really that you need to face the past and understand the past in order to prevent injustice in the present and then prevent recurrence in the future. So with that in mind, like I said, I'll just focus on sort of 3 points to keep in mind when looking at the forward-looking aim of transitional justice, which is prevention or non-recurrence. The first is the importance of connecting the dots between past and present violations. The second point is the importance of opening broader public dialogue. And the third is to plan for the long term. So on the first point about connecting the dots between the past and present, I think it's been interesting and inspiring to see the way in which the public discussion around our current present day violations have shifted. If you look in the media, I think when I compare it to the response to Michael Brown's murder 5-6 years ago, it was still more focused on the present, but now I think in response to the murder of George Floyd, it's really increasingly, you see many people commenting on how this is a product of the legacy of slavery. This is a product of entrenched white supremacy, and that it's not one bad policeman or one bad police force, but it's a problem that all of us face within the US society in our different positions. So I think, thinking about that and with the transitional justice lens, it's really important to frame present day problems in their historical context. And I think that's the starting point, because if we don't understand the problem or the magnitude of the problem, we can't then devise an appropriate solution. And I think in the US context, and all the initiatives that the previous panelists have talked about are framing it in this way, we have a systemic problem, which therefore requires a systemic response. One law reform or one response alone is not enough. We need to look at it from multiple angles and address it from multiple angles. And so in that context, thinking about it from the experiences of transitional justice can help frame the discussion to focus on the root causes, the context, the systems and structures that have allowed this to happen and continue to allow it to happen in the present. Another point that's really important when we think about connecting the dots between past and present, and here I quote Michael Ignatieff when he said that the role of a truth commission is to limit the realm of permissible lies. And that he was referencing the South African Truth Commission, which, as some of you may know, was widely broadcast on national television and radio stations. So it got to a point that white South Africans who had been living in their parallel universe and didn't think much was going on could finally no longer deny the atrocities of apartheid. Of course, there were still some that tried to, but there was a certain baseline that was no longer permissible in the social sphere. And I think for the US, that's a very important point. Looking also at Guatemala, there, the Historical Clarification Commission helped place the violations that took place against indigenous population in the sphere of the broader counterinsurgency campaign of the military. And in speaking with victims there, they said it was really important to have their name cleared, because without that historical context, there were rumors at the local level that, oh, so-and-so was killed because he had a feud with his neighbor, or he was a criminal. And so the importance of clearing the names of victims that were targeted purposely through these different initiatives is essential also to clearing the lies from our society. Then number two, the second point I want to talk about is the importance of opening broader public dialogue and catalyzing conversations. So I think when we think about that, there's sort of sub-elements. One is really to provide acknowledgement, to build empathy, and then to raise awareness in the public sphere. And this is a real challenge in the US context where there's limited political will, and also we're not, like in South Africa, experiencing a major transition of power. There's not an end of a conflict, so not everyone is, focused on this moment in the same way, although recently that has been changing. So the challenge is to find ways to really open up public space and inject the discussion, a very needed discussion about the past. In doing so, I think there's something to keep in mind is the balance between the need for outreach and raising awareness among the broader public and the need for healing and protected spaces for survivors or communities who've been harmed. And I just want to share from Canada, where they had a truth commission to deal with the legacy of Indian residential schools. So a system similar to what we had here in the US, where Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and put in boarding schools run by the churches and the state, with the aim, and this is from policy, to kill the Indian in the child. So after, there was a settlement agreement between Indigenous, the First Nations, Government of Canada and churches that set up a truth commission that lasted for 5 years, had 7 national hearings across the country, and to my mind is one of the most successful in terms of adopting a survivor-centric approach. I went to several of the public hearings where you had public health or mental health support that was both Indigenous and from the government of Canada. There were a lot of rituals that were really respectful and honoring the local culture and traditions. And so I think for many of the survivors I spoke with, it was a really transformational opportunity to get questions answered about their own past, to connect with people and with their own history. Yet unfortunately, if you ask the average Canadian today, do they know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Many of them don't. And I think this is a challenge that we face here in the United States. Again, without this momentous transition, how do you capture the attention of those who most need to learn from these facts that are being told and analyzed and revealed? But then how do you balance that also with protecting the needs of survivors of harmed communities? And I think to that, you need to develop a range of activities that target the different groups, because sometimes those two objectives can be in contradiction of each other, right? What might raise the profile of a truth commission or memorialization initiative or reparations initiative might put at risk some survivors. So in Canada, what they did was they had public hearings where there was a public facing side with an exhibition that was meant to inform students about the history of the violations. And then inside the Truth Commission, which was a space much more geared towards survivors, they had all the health supports I talked about and community listening circles and lots of different ways for survivors to tell their story and get the support they needed. Another point in thinking about opening broader public dialogue is to really think about engaging the arts and culture. And so I think the work that Piper shared really speaks to this very well. And I've seen this in other contexts as well, that I think everywhere, but particularly when there's a challenge in terms of political will, or there are certain groups that are not hearing the message or intent on spoiling the message that the work to advance justice, arts and culture can be a way of reaching those people in a way that they can hear. So for example, in Tunisia, at a time where there was kind of backlash against the work of the Truth Commission, it was a few years after the revolution, people were becoming a bit disillusioned. We worked with a group of intergenerational Tunisian women who had experienced repression in different ways, and worked with them to put together an interactive art exhibition that captured women's experiences of repression. And people who visited the site shared with us that, you know, they hadn't really realized that many women had been imprisoned, and even if they weren't imprisoned, what the suffering that they went through, and that this exhibition allowed them to explore and talk about issues that are still a bit taboo and not really fully addressed in society. And finally, in terms of thinking about opening public dialogue, I think it's also essential to keep in mind that this is so important to raise awareness and build empathy. And I think anything that we do needs to be followed, as the other panelists have mentioned, with reforms and changes. And many of those reforms and changes and reparations will require the support of the broader public and the taxpayers. And so if they're not informed about what's going on and why it's a responsibility of present day citizens to remedy these problems, even if it took place years ago, they will likely not support some initiatives. We saw this, again, I refer to Canada, before the Truth Commission passed, there was something called the Kelowna Accords that was up for approval, and it was a $5 billion package that was aimed to bridge the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, and it was struck down. And at the time, the chief of the Assembly of First Nations said he was really disappointed that the Truth Commission bill passed, but not the Kelowna Accords, because in some way the Kelowna Accords was actually investing directly back into the communities that most needed it. But the Canadian public wasn't yet at a point to understand why that was their responsibility as taxpayers. So the last point is to plan for the long term. And I think, as all of the panelists know, and those who have been working in this field, transitional justice, or the fight for justice, is not, it's a long-term process. It's not a destination. We never get to that reconciliation easily. What we need to focus on is the process, and the process itself can be reparative, can be healing, or not. So it's really important to think about that process. And in trying to plan for the long term, when there is political opening, when there is some space to move initiatives forward, to try and build in as much protection as possible, whether a dedicated budget line or a decree that has a follow-up body. So finally, one last example from Canada, there in the settlement agreement, they had established a Truth Commission, and then the Truth Commission was mandated to develop a follow-up body, which is the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, that would house all the archives of the Truth Commission and continue its work. And that body is housed within the university. And in contrast to a Truth Commission, which is a temporary ad hoc body, this is a permanent institution. So thinking ahead of how to build in and secure the legacy of any initiative that's going on when we have the political will, when we have the political space. So I just want to close with a quote from James Baldwin from his novel Just Above My Head that says, "Not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. If one refuses abdication, one begins again." And I hope that this framing of transitional justice and all this work can help us find ways to take responsibility and begin again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginie. We now pass a very quick second round of questions, because we are receiving also questions from the audience. So, but there are a few things, very important things that I would like to ask each and every of you, starting with Dr. Daniels. Of course, reparation, a big responsibility, a big banner of your efforts. The concept and the framing of reparation as a remedy has evolved in this country as globally. So can you tell us a little bit what has guided your work, how you see the concept of reparation being understood by a significant variety of different survivors and victims, which is always the challenge, you know, to respond and satisfy to a critical degree the right holders. So yes, please, Dr. Daniels.
Well, let me just practice a little rapid speak here, because we do want to get the audience involved. And I think at the beginning I tried to be concise and whatnot, and but we are now pressed against the wall. So let me just quickly say a couple of things. One, for those in the audience who really want to follow the work of the National African American Reparations Commission, we have a 10-point program, which is modeled after the CARICOM Reparations Commission. I won't go into all the details of that, but you can find it at ibw21.org, ibw21.org. We have the most extensive online reparations resource center of anywhere in the world on the IBW website. So you can just spend hours and hours and hours there. I think some of the critical points is to reference the fact that we not only talk about individual benefits, and this was sort of referenced earlier, we also talk about collective benefits. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about how do we repair communities, and communities are more than the sums of the individual people who have been damaged and who have suffered harm. And I'm not belittling that, but community is much bigger than that. You look at Tulsa, Greenwood. I mean, if we compensated, there's only one survivor, by the way, I think 107 years old or whatever, and none of them were ever compensated. But if you compensated them all, Greenwood or Black Wall Street was destroyed. How do you redevelop that? And so we focus on things like land and economic development and creating healthcare facilities and community economic developments as a way of healing and repairing communities. I have to say quickly that this issue of memory is so important, and it's painful. It's like why we do this ceremony called a Ma'afa. The way forward is to look back, because it is very painful. And I sit here and I just listen to all of the different massacres that have taken place, and people need to face them. They need to see them. And so point 10 of the reparations program we have is about memory. It is about sacred sites. It's about all of those, because that's an important part of the healing process that also has to take place. Let me just say quickly in terms of the implementation of reparations, the concept of restorative justice is at the center of it. And that is to say that you cannot have the people who perpetrated the harm define the remedy. That's like fundamental to the overall process. And I have to say that because there are people who say, oh yeah, we did it and here's what we want to do for you. No, it doesn't go that way. The people who have suffered the harm must define or accept the remedy. And we have to internalize that. We have to be bold enough to say that. And there also must be an ability, particularly when it comes to resources, to independently control resources. So we can't have a situation where people say, yes, this is what it's about, but we will control. No, that control must rest in the hands of the people who have been harmed and who have been injured. And I'm proud to say that, again, in Evanston, Illinois, and other places that we're moving around the country, we are instilling these principles. The last thing I would say is we do have to guard against ordinary public policy or good ideas being defined as reparations. Reparations has a specific derivative definition. And really, for African Americans, it has to do with what David talked about and talking about his lineages and heritage. It is about enslavement and all of the ancillary and derivative things that came from that, including post-emancipation discriminatory policies that targeted Black communities. So it is the Homestead Act, it is FHA, it's the GI Bill, it is redlining, it is all of those things, but it has a specific definition and a specific derivative. So no matter how good other policies might be, Equity Commission law, that they're great, but we have to guard against things that everything being called reparations, no matter how well-meaning.
Thank you very much. Piper, sorry, Mrs. Anderson, actually Dr. Daniels has pointed at something that is very important also to us, you know, the participation. Restorative justice is a concept of victim-centered approach, and the participation of what I call the right holders to the process not only reparation, but only every process that brings acknowledgement, accountability, and justice in general. So I would be, if you could share with us, because I know that this was very much something that you paid a lot of attention. And so we would like to hear how practically and even theoretically, when you started, designed the process of community participation so that enabled this to become a real process for them, perceived for them, and endorsed by them.
So I think you mentioned that my background is in the arts, is in applied theater. I spent many years teaching theater to young people in all around New York City, but mostly in Bushwick. And my students would come in to the studio, and they would use the studio space, the theater space, to work through trauma that they had experienced in their families and in their homes. And then it became really clear that I needed to understand how people move trauma through their bodies and through storytelling and through narrative, and spent several years studying trauma as a result. That work led me to Rwanda at the end of the Kagaka process there. And that process really inspired me, right? Like, so the Kagakas were 12,000 community tribunals, community courts around Rwanda after the genocide. And, Kagaka means, is loosely translated as, justice amongst the grass. And so I was really inspired by this idea of going to where community was, creating a space in which people could reckon with harm together. That also really spoke to my experience working, doing mediation processes and community accountability processes in community here. And so the narrative piece I knew was really critical to that. And an understanding of trauma is really critical to that. So people, that when we were designing the process around where we centered storytellers or testimonials, one of the things that I would do was like have these one-on-one sessions with each of the narrators, as well as a group session with them, where one of the things that I would ask them is, tell the story that you own, not the one that owns you. Because a lot of times what happens in this process is that people tell a story hoping that they're going to get a certain result, and they don't get the result that they hope for. And that's devastating. And so a lot of the processes that we're talking about, around the world, the problem is that for instance, in Canada, you would ask many First Nations people, and they'll tell you that the harm didn't stop, right? The harm did not actually stop. And so there was a lot of disappointment in what came out of that process. There's a lot of disappointment that comes out of a lot of processes, because the people who have committed harm are the ones who are defining what repair looks like. Because in the end, what people think that they want at the beginning of a process looks very different from what they want at the end of a process. And there's no space for that. There's no space for that to hold the contradictions that just come with healing from trauma. And that as a part of the process of giving voice, offering testimony, is only the beginning. It's not the end. So when institutions design a process and they say, we're going to, bookend this, and it starts here and it ends here, and here's your check, and they walk away, there's a lot of devastation that's left at the end of that. For people, for individuals, and for communities. It can lead to even more harm. It has led to a lot of, suicide and like other kinds of, as Dr. Daniel said, like there is a cost to talking about this and to naming this and telling the story over and over again. And so for me, it's really important to make sure that people are ready and that they know that they don't have to do this, right? They have to do what feels safe for them, what feels supported for them. And my job as a facilitator of a process is to hold that, is to hold the audience, the community members accountable as they bear witness, and to support them as they move through that process in a way that feels supported and feels like that will lead to healing.
Thank you very much. David, I'm going to ask you to keep it really, really short, a couple of minutes. Yeah, but it's something that we are very keen in discussing further, particularly with your commission, which is this eternal dilemma of, not dilemma, but the quest for maintaining support and increasing the understanding, because these experiences are certainly primarily for victims and survivors, their dignity, their rights, their their self-individualized, perception of themselves vis-a-vis the rest of the community. But they, hopefully, we are trying to persuade, to tell a story that was denied, repressed, erased, whatever. So, in your commission, what are you thinking about this? So what type of strategies are you thinking of?
Man, I got 2 minutes. Okay. All right. So I'll make it real quick. And I love that Piper is such an artist. That's great. And in the same realm as me, I'm a storyteller. That's really what I bring to this commission more than anything else, is storytelling. That's what it's about. It's about the story. It's about reminding people of the basic tenets of humanity. This is what I say for my life, and this is what I say for the life of my son. This is what I say for everybody's life. Don't you just want to be happy? Is that too much to ask? So why should anyone be deprived of the opportunity to be happy? And so much in our society, both past, present, and hopefully not the future, it does that. It just deprives us of the opportunities to be happy. Life is finite. We don't have that much time in the grand scheme of things. I don't want to waste my time depriving someone else of their happiness. And no one should be spending their life depriving someone else of their happiness, and certainly defending those who have. So for me, in the stories that we can share in the hearings and just our presentation of the history of racial terror lynchings, I want to bring back to that crucial point. These are very explicit and carnal examples of people's opportunities to happiness being deprived. And on the basic fundamental level that we all share, which is humanity, that should hurt you. That should disturb you at your core. And I think what we've seen this year in 2020, where we've seen the lynchings of Ahmaud Arbery, the lynching of George Floyd, the lynching of Breonna Taylor, so forth, and so forth, are these opportunities where the world was able to see, particularly with George Floyd, over 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we saw a lynching. We saw the removal of life in front of our very eyes, and it disturbed us. And it was a very clear reminder that, yes, humanity matters. Humanity matters from all people. And when we see humanity taken away in such a callous, inhumane way, it disturbs us. This is the continuation of history. It has not gone away. It has just evolved. So if that disturbs you, if George Floyd's lynching disturbed you, then the lynchings of King Johnson, of George Armwood should also disturb you. And the systems that those lynchings supported and certainly benefited from should also disturb you, because at the core is the deprivation, is the removal of opportunities to be happy. Why should anybody be deprived of that? Hopefully that was under 2 minutes.
It certainly was. I'm very, very grateful. I'm going to now ask Professor Trahan to guide me through the questions. I know that we have already collected a number of very interesting questions. Jennifer?
Yes, thank you. What an amazingly rich discussion this was. Thank you so much to all the panelists and to Anna Myriam in leading us through this discussion. I guess I'm going to take moderator prerogative and ask a first question, but combine it with two of the questions that I see coming in. And this is, I want to start first with Dr. Daniels, but then maybe others can also weigh in. Can we start in this country with reparations? Or do we need a broader acknowledgement? Do we need a truth commission first? Virginie spoke of a broader public dialogue. There are skeptics in this country. I know you're not talking to them on this panel, but can you go to reparations without a truth commission is my question. And then one of the questions that has come in through the Q&A is this a good time to push for reparations just because because of the debt and where the country is economically due to COVID? So, and then we have transitional justice expert Louis Bickford writing in and basically asking, how do we reach those who don't want to listen? They're outside the bubble. You know, we can't just have a conversation among ourselves. It's really the difficulty of reaching all Americans and the skeptics and those who don't want to listen. So sorry, I paraphrased this far less articulately than he has written, but just for the sake of time, I'm shortening it that. So let me start by asking kind of that package of 3 questions.
Well, quickly, let me start with a couple of the last ones. Let me situate the issue of power in this conversation. Because I think that at the end of the day, if we look at some of the great social movements that have advanced, yes, people were persuaded, but it was also because the groups who were oppressed organized themselves to exert power. And so while I want to persuade more people to do better, we also have to focus on power, the ability of people to organize themselves. And so the issue of persuasion, I believe in public dialogue because I'm just believe in the vision thing. So I think if more people knew better, they would do better. But given the reality of white privilege and the fact that there are people and institutions that benefit from structural institutional racism, it's not quite as easy as persuasion. There are benefits that go with this. And so there is a margin, and that is a critical margin of people who will be persuaded. And I think David is absolutely right. The public lynching of George Floyd just took people to a whole nother level, giving an additional margin of folks who are prepared to move forward. On the question of financing and funding, I mean, this crisis has shown us that this government, when it gets ready, can write a check. They're writing checks, right? And so that's not an issue. And we can do it on the installment plan and put it off to the future and so forth and so on. But they have shown us that when it really matters, if they feel threatened, they will write a check. And finally, I think the time is right for reparations now. I mean, I don't know when there's there's studies after studies after studies after studies have been done. That's why the original HR 40 was just a study bill. It was really as an organizing tool. It was that. But so much has happened. And the public opinion polls are showing that, by the way. It's showing more. First of all, we as African Americans had to persuade ourselves because we're injured. And we have pain and trauma. Dealing with this is not an easy thing. So now we're at 75, 80%. But now the polls are showing a shift of maybe 50, 60, about 56% of white Americans are now inclined to accept reparations as well. But at the end of the day, what I would say is we also have to exert power, because that's the ultimate solution. You do it with righteousness and justice and all that. But you can't wait for those who are not inclined simply to give you permission to ask for and demand that there be remedy for damages that have been done.
Thank you for that. I don't know if David or Piper would like to come in on that set of questions.
I'll just say I agree with Baba Ron on everything that he said. People, money is arbitrary. You see what I'm saying? Like, we can create money out of thin air. It's just an agreement on some notion of currency. So yeah, U.S. can write a check and they need to write a check. You're right. The time is now. Again, we're seeing 2020 has been a year of revelation, and that's not to sound biblical or apocalyptic, but it really has revealed a lot that people in the know have known for years and generations. But now we've gotten a crash course in history and civics and philosophy and ideology, and it's only October 19th. We still got we still got some time to go before 2020 comes to a close. So it really has exposed people to a lot of the intricacies of this country, and they haven't had a choice. That's the most important thing. So you're right. Privilege, particularly white privilege, allows you to ignore a lot of these circumstances. 2020 said, not anymore. And I appreciate that. This year has done most of the work for me. So now it's more like, I told you so, and let's get to work. Because again, when you've had these moments of just clear deprivation of humanity, whether it is a lynching, whether it is just the refusal to provide, resources and help to your fellow citizens because of this global pandemic. It's like, okay, something is clearly wrong. And it doesn't always matter about your race. It doesn't always matter about your socioeconomic status, but that certainly has a lot to do with it. But everybody's got a 2020 story. And I think that has primed people to say, you know what, there need to be some fundamental changes in how this country operates. When did we ever care this much about the Supreme Court? When did we ever care this much? When did we ever care so much about the composition of the Senate? When have we cared so much about who's running the country? When have we cared so much about how the system actually works? I've never seen it before in my lifetime, but thank God we here. We need people to be activated. So many people have been activated because of this year. And look at what has happened so far. Look at how the conversation has changed. The fact that we're talking about things like reparations in such an explicit, unapologetic way. The fact that I'm seeing article after article in all these major newspaper and media sites about not just racism and the N-word and stuff like that, but like institutional racism, getting into the weeds about how this looks. That gives me hope. That gives me confirmation, from the ancestors, from the past, that their work has never been in vain, that it was going to take time. But for us in this generation, the time is here. So there's again, I'm getting a little existential right now. You're noticing that a lot of the elders are passing on. We talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We're talking about John Lewis. Their time is done. They're laid to rest. They have done their work. Their time is gone. It's our time now. And I think they have given us enough of a game plan and enough of an energy to do what we feel seems impossible at times, but it's so necessary. And it was impossible for them at their time. I mean, look what RBG did in their time. Look what John Lewis did in their time. They're around my age now. So how can I not be encouraged and strengthened by what they were able to do and not recognize the privileges that I have now to do my work in my time? That's what I'm going to do.
Wow, David, thank you. I think it's probably hard to speak after David has spoken so eloquently right now. Would Piper or Virginie like to come in that first set of questions?
I know there's a couple other questions I want to just.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know there's other questions, so I want to.
Yeah, okay. Well, Virginie, you'll also pass. So I'm going to put, again, just for the sake of time, two of them together. One has written, will the Maryland Truth and Reconciliation Commission work with other groups to share stories of lynchings nationwide and also investigate apparent, quote, suicide hangings that have happened in 2019, 2020 across the US? Can there be an independent organization to record and investigate the hangings of these people that report to local, state, and federal government? Thank you all for your incredible work and for helping us all collectively heal is one. And let me just read out just one more. The plan for reparations has to include attention to adverse childhood experiences of transgenerational trauma. This is rampant in communities of color due to the experience of institutional racism, ongoing oppression, and continued experience of public lynching traced back to slavery. What role does mental health service play in the 11-point program, the push for reparations? So I think those will be our last questions. And maybe I'll again start with Dr. Daniels, if he would like to start us off.
Quickly, let me just refer to the last point. I'm glad it got raised. And sadly to say that one of our commissioners, Nana Patricia Newton, who was such an incredible psychiatrist on a commissioner, recently passed away. But she was one who really talked about transgenerational epigenetic damages that have gone, that the whole notion that has now scientifically been verified, the damages to the genes across generations, which really people are saying that when you start talking about the COVID pandemic, for example, that is a precondition in and of itself. It's the precondition to the precondition. So yes, our 10-point program does speak to health and mental health. There's a whole point, I don't remember which one it is, that deals with health and mental health as a part of it, because that is an incredibly important part of our healing process.
And David, there was part of that question specifically to you.
So what I'll say is that one of our biggest challenges is that we get a lot of people reaching out to us and saying, hey, can you look into this lynching? Can you look into this potential lynching? And yes, we want to. We have to be mindful of our charge, which does focus on, again, the confirmed racial terror lynchings between 1854 and 1933. However, we do have some leeway in the law to discover new things. Now, I think just because of there's so much that we could do, but we have very limited time. So we are focusing on that timeline, again, the 1854 to 1933. But all the work that we're doing is to really set the groundwork and the framework for future commissions. So this is not meant to be just the 2 or 3 years that we got and then we're out. No, we want future commissions we want this commission to continue, even if it evolves to look at, again, these instances of racial terror in the current time. And again, we want other commissions to come out of this all across the country and organizations to come out of this that are doing this work. So what I will say is stick with us, follow us, ask us questions. This is a commission for the people. So there's nothing really behind closed doors that we are doing. This is all out in the open because we want the people to be involved in the work that we're doing. This won't get done without the people. Let me be abundantly clear about that as well. So if you are interested in our process, we're chronicling it, but ask us questions as well. Challenge us on the approaches that we're taking. There was a question about a commission in Maine. I did not know about that commission in Maine, but I'm going to learn about that commission in Maine and see what I can learn about it. So this is an iterative process. This is a collective process. We want to do this to the best of our abilities. We will not be perfect, so I'm saying that right now, but we want to make sure we're in the groundwork so that people can pick up the baton where we leave off, although we don't want to really take the baton, give the baton up anyway, because we want to continue this work in the state of Maryland and just make sure we are part of the movement so that this is done all across the country and around the world.
Piper, do you have any either closing reflections or answers to that last 2 set of questions?
I guess I'll just invite everyone to, go to the Rikers Memory website. It's rikersmemoryproject.org to learn more about the initiative. And there's lots of opportunities to collaborate with us in the next year or so. The other thing I'll say is that there was someone had asked a question about non-recurrence in the US. And mentioned that it seemed like that would be more politically winnable. And I would say that non-recurrence means an end to white supremacy, right? So it's not actually, so I think when we talk about people who are not as willing to engage in the conversation, I would say those folks realize that there's something really at stake for white people in getting on board with this. I don't think that they realize that when we talk about non-recurrence in the US context, we're talking about ending the existing systems and structures that benefit whiteness, that benefit white people, that they will not continue to get a leg up the way that they have for several hundred years. And that's a very different reality that many white people are only beginning to, since this summer, beginning to acknowledge, right? So I think going all the way to reparations and accountability and everything that comes with that means a complete transformation in this country that at this point, I don't think that many white people are ready for. I don't think a lot of us are ready for, but that is the work. That is the absolute work. That is the kind of cultural transformation that has to happen when you attack anti-Blackness and when you attack the systems of racial terror in this country. So that's my final thought.
Thank you. Virginie, I think you're going to get the last word.
Sure. Thank you. I think I couldn't agree more with what Piper just said, and I think builds on the question that somebody asked about public education and how to get some of this. I think it's true that the realization is coming too late for many, and if you think about what you learn in school, some of you may know that there was a textbook in Texas up until recently called Slaves Workers, right? So just erasing from the history the truth about what that was. It's been corrected, but at the request of a student and a mother. So I think, David, I hope that the Maryland Lynching Truth Commission can do as much as possible to connect with education. I'm a resident of Maryland, happy to help out. I'm on the PTA, so we can connect the dots there. But I think sometimes some of the older generations maybe aren't really ready to get there, but we can start with the young kids. And when you get to them in terms of justice and what's fair, and like I talked to my kids, like, what, why is that? That's not fair. So hopefully we can start getting our younger kids also aware and ready to take this work forward, because as I said, it's a long process and we're just beginning.
Well, thank you so much. I'm told, unfortunately, our time is up, and I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, and I apologize for that. We had some really, really amazing speakers. I hope for NYU and for the International Center for Transitional Justice, this is the start of our dialogue on these topics, and that we continue. These were fantastic presentations, and we have learned so much from our speakers tonight. Thank you so much, and thanks to the audience. Good night.